Night hangs soft over a low Irish hill. The grass is slick with dew. Somewhere ahead, under the roots of an old hawthorn, a sound is ticking through the dark. Tip-tap, tip-tap. Tip-tap, tip-tap. It is the sound of a tiny hammer on leather. In the stillness, you can almost pick out a tune under the tapping. A high, shrill voice singing at its work. 19th century poet William Allingham captured that sound in a famous piece about the fairy Shoemaker, describing the busy click of an elfin hammer under a grassy mound and promising that if you could only catch sight of the singer and keep him in your gaze, you're a made man. You step closer. There, under the bush, is a figure no bigger than a child, but far older in the face. A little man, coat buttoned tight, sharp eyes glinting in the half-light. In some country stories recorded in the 1930s by the Irish Folklore Commission's Schools collection, children described him just like this. A wee man with red cap and green coat, sitting under the trees at the edge of the village, mending shoes and singing as he worked. You lunge. Your hand closes on rough cloth. You have him. He twists and protests, but you hold on. Tradition says that if a human can catch a leprechaun and never once look away, the captor may force him to reveal where he's buried his hoard of gold. The treasure crocks that, according to 19th century collectors like W.B. Yeats and 20th century folklorists like Catherine Mary Briggs, were dug up from the ground where warriors hid them in wartime. The little man smiles. He promises wealth, even 3 wishes if you will only let him go. But every word he uses is a riddle. Every promise has 2 edges. You glance just once toward the dark bush where he says your fortune lies. And in that heartbeat, the cloth in your hand collapses. The leprechaun is gone. Only footprints in the damp earth. Only the faint echo of a hammer and a story that has slipped through your fingers. This is Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened, a podcast about the stories that refuse to die. I'm your host, and today's episode is The Shoemaker's Gold. The leprechaun is one of the most recognizable figures in world folklore, a small, sharp-witted being from Ireland, famous for his pot of gold, his love of trickery, and his habit of vanishing the moment you blink. Modern summaries, like those by folklorists and writers at Irish Myths and World History Encyclopedia, usually define him as a solitary Irish fairy, short in stature, obsessed with shoemaking and practical jokes, and guarding hidden treasure somewhere out in the landscape. But that familiar image, the little man in green at the end of the rainbow, is only one chapter in a much longer story. Early Irish texts show something stranger and older, water sprites called leprechaun grappling with a sleeping king, medieval scribes revising tales for comic effect, and 19th century poets and collectors fixing the leprechaun in red jackets, not green. Today, we trace the legend from its earliest known sources, explore how it changed across centuries, and ask why this elusive shoemaker still matters in a world of serial mascots and sports logos. Along the way, we will lean on medieval sagas, oral accounts preserved in the National Folklore Collection, 19th century literature, and modern scholarship. Underneath all of that is a simple question. What does this legend reveal about the people who told it? About how they understood work, wealth, and the danger of easy luck? Now, to follow the leprechaun's trail, we have to go back more than 1,000 years to the rugged coastline of Ulster and a king named Fergus MacLetty. The earliest text that scholars generally agree resembles the leprechaun legend appears in a medieval Irish tale called Ectra Fergus Maich Letty, The Adventure of Fergus son of Letty. According to the edition and dating work of Celtic scholar D.A. Binchy, discussed in a 1952 study and summarized by modern commentators such as Laura O'Brien of the Irish Pagan School, the surviving version is preserved in a later manuscript at Trinity College, Dublin, though scholars date the text itself to the 8th century. In this story, Fergus, king of Ulster, falls asleep on a beach. As he sleeps, a group of tiny beings called leprechaun, literally little bodies, creep up from the water. As summarized in the Fergus MacLetty article on Irish legend and by World History Encyclopedia, they steal his sword and try to drag him into the sea. Fergus wakes when his toes touch the cold water, seizes 3 of the creatures, and refuses to release them until they grant him 3 wishes. Those wishes are not for pots of gold. In this earliest version, the leprechaun offer powers. According to adaptations reviewed on sites like Mythos Journey and Irish Central, Fergus demands the ability to breathe underwater so he can explore the depths, among other feats. The text is part of the wider Ulster cycle of heroic tales, and the episode with the water sprites is only one moment in a longer saga that ends with Fergus facing a terrifying sea monster called Muirdris. So where is the leprechaun in all this? Linguistically, most etymologists connect our modern word to those leprechaun. Etymology resources such as the entry at Etym and recent discussions in Irish myths point out that Old Irish leprechaun probably means small body, from roots meaning little and body, and that later Middle Irish forms like leprechaun give rise to modern leprechaun and English leprechaun. Some recent Celtic linguists, whose findings are summarized by Patrick Sims-Williams and reported in that same etymological discussion, have proposed a more adventurous route, tracing the word back to the Roman Luperci and the festival of Lupercalia, via a chain of medieval scholarly misunderstandings. But even those scholars agree that by the time the word appears in Irish, it is being used for small, otherworldly beings like Fergus's leprechaun. What is striking is what these earliest sources do not say. In Ectra Fergus Maicleti, the diminutive beings live underwater, not under mounds. They are not cobblers. They carry no hammers, make no shoes, and hoard no gold. They grant 3 wishes here, but they are not yet the standard wish-givers of later folktale. Modern writers like Laura O'Brien emphasize that this is a marginal episode in a larger hero's tale, not a stand-alone fairy legend. Leprechaun-like creatures, she notes, rarely appear in the main mythological cycles themselves, and when they do, they are supporting characters. The figure that will later become the leprechaun starts life not as the star of the show, but as a strange interruption, a cluster of little bodies hauling a king toward the sea. In modern terms, this is the prologue, a seed of a legend attached to a hero saga in a Christianizing Ireland, where scribes are copying ancient stories into new manuscripts. What happens next, how those watery leprechaun become land-dwelling shoemakers guarding buried treasure, depends on centuries of retelling. And as the story moves from manuscript to fireside, something important changes. Now, as the legend travels out of the monasteries and into vernacular storytelling, a new figure steps into focus, the solitary shoemaker. By the 18th and 19th centuries, descriptions of leprechauns in Ireland look very different from the water sprites of Fergus's tale. Literary accounts, dialect dictionaries, and folklore anthologies begin to fix the leprechaun as a tiny, elderly man whose main occupation is making shoes and whose great secret is the location of hidden wealth. One of the earliest English-language references is in Thomas Dekker and Thomas Middleton's early 17th century play The Honest Whore, Part 2, which mentions an Irish lubricant as a kind of summoned spirit. 19th century lexicographer John O'Donovan, in his supplement to O'Reilly's Irish-English Dictionary, glosses related Irish words, lugarcan, luprechaun, as a sprite, a pygmy, a fairy of a diminutive size, who always carries a purse containing a shilling, tying the being directly to money. By the 1830s, Irish novelist Samuel Lover offers one of the most detailed portraits. In Legends and Stories of Ireland 1831, quoted in modern summaries from CBS News and other cultural histories, he describes the leprechaun as quite a beau in his dress, wearing a red square-cut coat, richly laced with gold, and inexpressibles of the same cocked hat, shoes, and buckles. Here, the leprechaun is not in green at all, but in red and gold, smartly dressed in the style of an earlier century. Poet William Allingham adds important details in his poem The Leprechaun or Fairy Shoemaker, first published in the mid-19th century and later included by W.B. Yeats in Fairy and Folktales of the Irish Peasantry, 1888. Allingham portrays a wrinkled, wizened, and bearded elf with spectacles on his nose, silver buckles on his hose, leather apron, and a shoe in his lap, hammering away and singing about the shoes he is making for fairy folk. Yeats himself, in the prose sections of that same anthology, classifies the leprechaun among what he calls the solitary fairies, beings who, unlike the great hosts of the Aussee, tend to appear alone and to delight in playing tricks. Drawing on earlier collectors like D.R. McAnally and T.C. Croker, Yeats repeats that the leprechaun is the fairy shoemaker, a miserly little man who sits by the roadside mending shoes and hoarding the treasure crocks he has unearthed from old hiding places. McAnally's 1888 collection, Irish Wonders, cited by later writers, including Irish myths, gives a vivid description. The leprechaun is about 3 feet high, in a little red jacket and breeches with buckles, gray stockings, and a cocked hat. In wet western districts, he throws a frieze coat over his finery, so that, unless on the lookout for the cocked hat, you might pass a leprechaun on the road and never know it's himself that's in it at all. Already the legend is doing cultural work. Scholars of Irish nationalism and folklore, like those discussed in studies of Ireland's fairy faith and identity construction, note that fairy figures often cluster in liminal spaces, raths, lone bushes, shorelines, marking the edges of human control. Here, the leprechaun stands at the edge of modernity itself, dressed like a relic of an older era, working alone at a traditional craft, jealously guarding wealth that comes from the disturbed soil of past conflicts. So far, we have watched a watery sprite become a land-dwelling shoemaker, but a legend really lives not in printed books, but in the spoken stories of ordinary people. And in those stories, the leprechaun is more than a quaint figure in red. He is a test. In this version of the tale, you do not meet the leprechaun in a king's saga or a poet's fancy. You meet him on the lane home from a neighbor's house or under a lone bush by the field. The National Folklore Collection at University College Dublin preserves thousands of such stories, gathered in the 1930s from schoolchildren across the country as part of the school's folklore scheme. In one entry from Bailey and Dware in County Galway, a boy named Charles McCabe records his parents' account of a leprechaun seen under some trees that are in the village yet today. The little man, they say, wore a red cap with a long peak, a green coat, and a long black trousers. He sat there making shoes, singing as he worked. The detail that delights the child recorder is practical. This leprechaun uses the tiny thorns from the hawthorn tree as tacks, and an awl made from a briar head to bore holes in the leather. This is not a vague spirit of luck, but a craftsman, improvising tools from the hedgerow. In another school's collection entry from Allenwood, County Kildare, a collector describes the leprechaun as a little ferryman who comes out on moonlit nights, dressed in a red coat, green trousers, yellow conical cap, silk stockings, and black shoes with silver buckles, sitting on a little hump of earth and shoeing fairy horses as he sings a shoemaker's song. Yet, in both literary and oral accounts, a pattern repeats. If a human watcher can catch or corner the leprechaun and keep eyes on him, they may demand gold or wishes. According to a 19th century folklore summary hosted by the University of Pittsburgh, the leprechaun is widely believed to own an inexhaustible purse or hidden crocks of treasure. Many stories begin with someone surprising him at his work and trying to force him to yield it. CBS's retelling, drawing on folklorist Catherine Mary Briggs, summarizes this motif. The leprechaun is a shoemaker who hides the money he makes in pots at the end of rainbows. But the human almost never wins. In the Galway School's collection story, the leprechaun is pestered so much for gold that he finally grows angry, utters a charm, and the man who demands riches collapses in a faint. When he wakes, the leprechaun is gone and is never seen there again. Other tales recorded in 19th century collections and repeated in modern overviews, like those on the Pitt Folklore site and the Irish Myths blog, describe more intricate tricks. A man catches the leprechaun and forces him to point out where his treasure is buried under a certain bush. The man ties his scarf around the bush to mark it and hurries home for a spade, only to return and find that every bush in the field now bears an identical scarf, or that the mark has vanished. In many variants, the moment the captor looks away to check the mark, to glance at a rainbow, to speak to someone, the leprechaun disappears. In all these stories, the rules are clear. The leprechaun may offer you 3 wishes or a pot of gold, but every word is dangerous. Several summaries, including tourist histories and folk encyclopedias, point out that the wishes often go wrong when the human acts out of greed or carelessness, leaving them humiliated or unchanged. Folklorists reading these tales have seen in them a kind of moral geometry. The leprechaun stands for sudden, unearned wealth, treasure left over from war, or money earned from a craft but hoarded in secret. Stories like those preserved in the National Folklore Collection warn that trying to snatch that wealth through cleverness alone is risky. If you lose focus for a moment, you end up with nothing but a story to tell. So far, we have traced the leprechaun from a marginal medieval sprite to a central figure in local cautionary tales, but there is still one major transformation ahead, because the little shoemaker in red has not yet put on the color everyone now expects. What happened next reveals something crucial about how legends evolve when they meet mass culture. If you picture a leprechaun today, chances are you see a bearded little man dressed all in green, perhaps with a pipe, perched at the end of a rainbow. Yet, as we have already heard, 19th century descriptions by Samuel Lover, D.R. McNally, and W.B. Yeats all dress him primarily in red, often with gold lace and an old-fashioned cocked hat. Modern popular explainers from CBS News, Slow Tours Europe, and other outlets repeatedly stress this point. The original leprechaun in Irish tales wore red, not green. Even much later oral accounts in the 1930s schools collection usually mix red and green, a red cap and green coat, or red coat and green trousers, rather than the head-to-toe bright green of today's parade costumes. So where did the all-green image come from? Cultural historians writing about Irish stereotypes note that green became a condensed symbol for Irishness in the 18th and 19th centuries, linked to nationalist causes and later to the global celebration of St. Patrick's Day. As tourism and mass advertising grew in the 20th century, companies and institutions looking for a friendly Irish mascot, from breakfast cereals to American sports teams, seized on the leprechaun and simply dressed him in the national color. Writers like Laura O'Brien, in a 2024 essay for the Irish Pagan School, argue that this modern mascot bears little resemblance to the figure found in Irish manuscripts and folklore collections. Instead, she suggests, many commercial images of leprechauns recycle 19th century stage Irish caricatures, grinning, hard-drinking, red-haired men in outdated clothes, used in British and American cartoons to mock the Irish as childish or buffoonish. This brings us to an important myth correction that scholars and tradition bearers repeatedly highlight. The common assumption that leprechauns have always worn green and that the little man on a cereal box or beer advertisement faithfully represents an ancient Celtic figure is not supported by the historical record. Descriptions from Lover, Allingham, Yeats, and McAnally uniformly place him in red, while 20th century accounts from the National Folklore Collection still show a small, solitary craftsman with a mixed but muted color palette, far from the bright cartoon image. Similarly, some modern popular articles, including features on sites like Ancient Origins and World History Encyclopedia, speculate that the leprechaun may be a diminished form of the older god Lugh, a bright warrior and craftsman figure from pre-Christian Irish mythology. But those same writers acknowledge that this is an interpretive link rather than a direct line of descent. The medieval texts about Fergus's Lushirpain never name Lugh, and major reference works like Daithi O'Hogan's Lore of Ireland treat the leprechaun as part of a later stratum of fairy lore rather than a surviving deity. As with the color of his coat, the temptation is to read the modern mascot backwards into the past, to imagine that what we see in parades and films is what medieval Irish listeners heard about. The sources tug in the opposite direction. They show a minor, local, often cranky craftsman spirit who becomes famous only when commercial culture discovers him. So far, we have watched the leprechaun put on new clothes and new meanings as Ireland itself changes. Now, let's step back and ask, what does this shape-shifting little figure actually tell us about work, wealth, and Irish identity then and now? When folklorists and cultural historians look at the leprechaun across these centuries, several themes stand out. First, there is the link between craft and wealth. In folklore definitions like the one proposed by the Irish Myths Project, the leprechaun's essential traits are his solitary nature, his shoemaking, his mischief, and his immense hidden wealth, usually in the form of crocks of gold. Yeats and McAnally both stress that this wealth is not random magic, but treasure recovered from the ground, treasure crocks buried of old in wartime. And Catherine Mary Briggs's Encyclopedia of Fairies, cited in CBS's survey, ties the pot of gold motif explicitly to money earned and hoarded by an indefatigable cobbler. Read this way: the leprechaun is not simply a luck fairy. He embodies an anxiety familiar in rural, small farm economies, that somewhere, someone is hoarding unearned or secret wealth. Legends of treasure-guarding dwarfs and goblins run across Europe. Modern folklorist Diarmid O. Giolan, as paraphrased in later summaries, has even suggested that the leprechaun may have more in common with those dwarfs and with household spirits than with the stately Aus Si of Irish mounds. Second, there is the moral of the chase. In almost every capture story, the human fails. The Dukas accounts show would-be treasure seekers ending up weak, faint, or simply tricked. 19th century collectors likewise record countless variants where the leprechaun exploits a brief distraction to escape. Scholars of folklore have often read such tales as warnings against greed or against trying to gain wealth through cunning bargains rather than steady work. A wish granted easily tends to backfire. A pot of gold seized without labor tends to evaporate. Third, the leprechaun is deeply tied to place. The Fergus MacLeody saga locates the leprechaun at a particular Ulster coastline and in a specific lake, Loch Rudrig. Fergus's doom comes when he tries to use their swimming gift where they warned him it would fail. Schoolchildren's accounts in the 1930s name specific bushes, fields, and villages where a leprechaun was seen over and over, until some encounter drives him away. This localization matters. Studies of the National Folklore Collection note that such stories helped rural communities map their own landscapes, marking certain spots as dangerous, powerful, or lucky. The leprechaun, sitting on a cais puka, a little hump of earth under a lone bush, singing as he hammers, makes that modest feature of the land into a node of possibility, a place where, if you are attentive, something out of the ordinary might happen. Modern culture often strips this away. The cereal box leprechaun could be anywhere. The sports mascot exists in a stadium, not by a specific hawthorn tree. Yet, the fascination persists. Articles from Ancient Origins to History Cooperative point out that even as the figure has become a cartoon, people remain intrigued by the idea of a small, elusive guardian of luck and wealth, hovering just out of reach. This brings us to the present. Today, leprechauns show up on St. Patrick's Day merchandise, in horror films, as university mascots, in economic metaphors like leprechaun economics, and in critical discussions of Irish stereotyping in global media. Cultural critics argue that using a leprechaun as shorthand for Irishness can flatten a complex culture into a handful of cliches: drink, luck, temper, and a comic accent. Irish writers and educators, including those behind projects like the Irish Pagan School and Irish Myths, have responded by digging back into the primary sources, insisting on the difference between commercial mascot and folklore figure. Yet even this tension says something important. The leprechaun survives precisely because he is adaptable. He can slide from medieval manuscript to fireside story, from schoolchild's notebook to cereal box, picking up new meanings along the way. He can be a warning against greed, a symbol of stubborn local distinctiveness, or a tongue-in-cheek emblem of national pride. At the heart of all these versions is a simple image, a small figure at the edge of things. Edge of a lake, edge of a field, edge of a rainbow. Working away at something that might make you rich, if only you could catch him and keep your eyes on him. So what have we learned from following the sound of that tiny hammer? The leprechaun, as the sources show, begins life in early medieval literature as a cluster of water sprites called leprechaun, dragging a king toward the sea, then emerges over centuries of storytelling as a solitary, red-coated shoemaker with secret hoards of wartime treasure. Along the way, oral traditions preserved in the National Folklore Collection and 19th century literary portraits fix his habits. He works and sings under lone bushes, can be forced to offer gold or wishes if captured, and almost always escapes through trickery. As commercial and nationalist cultures take hold, the leprechaun swaps red for green and becomes a global icon, even as scholars, collectors, and contemporary Irish writers work to correct misconceptions and reconnect the modern mascot to the more ambiguous, morally edge figure found in manuscripts and field notebooks. What remains constant is the legend's central question: what does it really mean to be lucky, and what might it cost to chase a shortcut to wealth? You've been listening to Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened, and our deep dive into the leprechaun, Ireland's elusive shoemaker and reluctant wish-giver. If you enjoyed walking this path from 8th century Ulster to 20th century school copybooks and 21st century parade floats, consider following the podcast in your listening app so you don't miss the next journey into the past. Next time, we'll stay in Ireland, but shift to another topic. We'll learn about Bridget of Kildare. Was she a saint? A goddess? Both? A real person or a deity? We'll dive into this story and try to untangle it with you. Until then, keep your ears open for small hammers in the dark, and be very careful what you wish for.